Hey, storytellers. Mary Rose Wood here. Thank you so much for taking the time to show up for this live stream talk about timelines and especially flashbacks. I am excited about this topic. And before we get started, I would love to invite anyone who's here who's not on the mailing list at pathofthestoryteller.com to get over there and get on the mailing list because there's a lot going on over the next few weeks. I'm enrolling students into the Path of the Storyteller program right now. We start September 1st. And so that is super exciting. And if you want to get on the mailing list, you're going to get all the details, special offers, coupons. It's wonderful. It's crazy good stuff happening over at Path of the Storyteller. I want to welcome those of you who are here live. If you're here live, I see a bunch of you are here. Please feel free to say hi in the comments. Let me know that you're here. Let me know that you're watching. Maybe let me know from where you're watching. Anne says hi. She says that she's late, and that's okay because today we're exploring the concept of time in fiction. And one of the things that we're going to discuss is just how flexible time can be. This doesn't mean that we all have a free pass to be late everywhere we go just because we're novelists. I mean, that would be nice. I would find it very convenient personally. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We are here to talk about time, however. So thank you all for coming and for getting here like close enough to the start. My name is Mary Rose Wood, for anyone who doesn't know me, if you're new to the YouTube channel, if you're watching the replay. And just so you know who I am, let me take a moment of your time to introduce myself. I am a writer. I'm best known for writing middle grade fiction. But as I'm going to talk about a little bit today, I didn't start out from my, girlhood knowing that I was going to be a novelist. I had some other adventures along the way. But I have 14 published novels with Big Five publishers. I am the founder of pathofthestoryteller.com, which is where I train and mentor writers. And I do this live stream every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific time, where we talk about writing craft, story structure, and the mindset of the working, thriving writer. And I think it is about time that we began. So I got a really interesting question recently from one of my Path of the Storyteller community members about flashbacks and about how to use them and how not to use them and when they work and when they're too much. And it just struck me that we've never really talked about this topic on the live stream. So I thought it was high time we did. So I want to share a little story. Some of you might have heard me talk about this before, but it's newly relevant because of this idea of time in storytelling. When I was, talk about a flashback. See, this is what I'm about to do. I'm segueing into a flashback. When I was 19 years old, see how that worked? I was in a Broadway musical called Merrily We Rolled Along. It was based on a Kaufman and Hart play that had this interesting structure with regards to the timing of the storytelling. It went backwards in time. So each scene of the play took place a little bit earlier in the timeline than the scene that preceded it. So how this worked in the much later musical adaptation of the play, they kept the same structure. So each scene, the characters started out, I think, sort of middle-aged, and at each scene they went back in time, so that by the end of the musical, we were all in the full dewy glow of youth, which is why they cast people my age. I was 19. There were a lot of people around my age. I think the youngest were 16. There were some in their early 20s. But they cast young people in the show because that's how we were going to end up. We were going to end up like our own ages, but it took the entire show to get there. Now, how did this work for the audience? Well, those of you who know anything about the theater know that Merrily, in its original incarnation way back in time in 1981, was a famous flop. And one of the reasons that it was a flop was because the poor audience didn't know what was going on. They could not follow the plot. Do you know why? Because it went backwards. So I just want everyone to know, by offering this flashback from my own past, now we'll come back into the present, I want everyone to know that to this very day, I am still a little traumatized by the difficulties of telling a story out of sequence, because I know all too well how dreadfully it can go wrong for the audience. If they get confused, we've lost them. So that's just a little personal story from my past. Now, you see how easy it was for me to bring that in. In life, in conversation, we do flashbacks all the time. We bring in information from the past all the time. But I don't think anybody here got confused about at what point I was talking about me in the present and me when I was 19. This was something I did way back in the day. And it's because I led you into the past with words. I told you what happened. And I came back to the present and I delivered the information that I wanted to share with you. So that didn't confuse you, right? But the audience in front of Merrily We Roll Along night after night at the Alvin Theater on Broadway was utterly confused because that's not the experience they had. They had a story that was simply being told backwards. There was not an adequate frame to bring them in and bring them back. It was a series of things happening, but the thing that they just saw happen did not cause the thing that they were about to see, because guess what? It happened in reverse order. So lesson number 1, we'll call this the Merrily We Roll Along lesson, is that delivering all the information to your reader is not adequate, because this is what folks say to me. This is what writers say, is I need the flashbacks because the reader needs the information. There's so much valuable, important information that I want my readers to have to really understand the story that I'm trying to tell. And my answer to that is, a kind but firm: storytelling is not information. Write it on your Post-it notes. Storytelling is not information. That's not what a story is. It is not delivering a boatload of information to your reader. The information may be fascinating. It may even inspire emotions, depending on what kind of information it is. But that's not storytelling. Storytelling involves change and causality. Those of you who are currently taking my course called Making Scenes have heard the phrase change and causality a lot of times. And that's because it's so central. If something happens and nothing changes, that's not a story. If 10 things happen and they don't have anything to do with each other, that's not a story. But if 10 things happen and something changes, and the change is because each of those 10 things was the cause of the next thing, so that by the time we get to the 10th thing, it's like a little string of dominoes just falling over, causing the next thing, causing the next thing, causing the next thing. We've got a beginning, we've got a middle, we've got an end, we've got change, we've got causality. It might not be a great story, but it is a story. So whenever you're talking about causality, you see how important sequence becomes. And this is why we have to be very, very careful, very skillful and intentional whenever we mess up the timeline of our narrative, which is what we do when we use flashbacks. Okay? I'm going to use, as I like to do in the warmer months, a baseball metaphor, because it's kind of the same thing. When you are watching a ball game, let's say there's 9 innings, right? And it's the ball game is happening. They do the innings in order. They don't randomly switch up the innings. It is an event in progress. And what happens now is like the consequence of what just happened. And the accruing of new events that are caused by previous events is what gets us to the end of the game, either cheering because our team won or sad because our team lost. If we watch the game like later, if it's already been played and we already know the outcome, it is not the same experience, right? Watching the highlight reel from a game is not quite the same experience as being there live or watching it live, not knowing how it's going to end. That is storytelling. This is why sports are such big business. A sporting event is a story being told. It's high stakes. It's got heroes and villains, right? Because we're rooting for one team or another. And it's got a world with well-defined rules so we can follow the action. So I just want to hang on to that image because it's sort of useful for us. Anytime we mess up the timeline, we're going to try the reader's patience a little bit. So that's just kind of a principle that we have to accept. Does this mean we should never do it? No, obviously not. You know that we also have to bring information into a story. Now, why do we have to bring information into a story? Why can't we just be in the eternal present of storytelling? Well, back to baseball. When people show up at a ball game, for the most part, they already know how the game is played. It doesn't need to be explained to them. They're going to the ballpark. They're there for a reason. They're fans. Every ball game follows the same rules. So they're literate in the world of baseball and they can follow the plot of the game without a lot of backstory, right? Now, the super fans will bring a lot of backstory with them. They'll know the history of each of the players and they'll have a sense of the rivalry between the teams. But anybody can go to a ball game if they know how baseball is played and sort of follow the progression of the game, right? Novelists don't have the same advantage because reading novels, alas, it's not that it's not the national pastime. People love to read novels, and I hope it does, qualify as being one of the national pastimes. But we as writers know that every time we write a book, we create a new story, we invent new characters. It's like we're inventing a new kind of sport. Our readers don't already come to the table knowing all the rules of the world. They don't know the histories of the players, if you will. They don't know the nuances of the backstory. They don't know how far back the rivalries go. They don't have all of that stuff that allows them to just drop in with full engagement and follow the story. We have no choice but to be skillful in how we weave in the backstory, the rules of the game, the history of the characters, the pre-existing relationships. I'm sure it makes pretty good sense, right? And by the way, those of you who are here live, and I see we've got lots of new arrivals, which is terrific, please feel free to post questions in the comments, your own observations, your favorite baseball team, whatever you want to add to the conversation is very welcome. That's one of the reasons I like to do these talks live, is so that we can have a little dialogue, a little participation. All right. So we've got these two kind of contradictory truths on the table already, right? Which is that messing with the timeline really runs the risk of confusing the reader. But by the same token, we have to bring in information from the past in order to make the story coherent to the reader, because they're new here. This is a new world we're inviting them in. It's a game they've not seen played before. Okay, I hope that makes sense. A couple of examples that comes to mind. If you imagine, watching Romeo and Juliet and not knowing that the Montagues and the Capulets don't like each other, right? The plot doesn't make sense without this key piece of information that is historical. This is a problem that goes way back. So we do really need to bring this type of stuff in. Now, how do we do it? I've got 3 basic ways that we bring information from the past into our stories. Maybe you can think of more, but I thought about it and I thought, well, there's really 3 basic ways. The first one, super plain, just tell the reader, summarize it, just put it out there. Tell them what the backstory is. Now, some of you might think, well, that might work for a third person narrator, where there's a kind of a narrator who can just tell the story of what's been. And that's obvious that it can. That's certainly one of the examples that comes to mind for me always is The Hobbit. It's got a wonderful third person narrator who is very occasionally intrusive, but for the most part, a third person narrator. And that book just starts out with like, this is what a hobbit is. This is what they're like. This is who Bilbo has been. It just gives us the backstory quickly, right up front, and isn't ashamed about it. Doesn't try to like tie a bow on it. It's just like, oh, I suppose that people don't know about hobbits these days. Let me tell you. It's got this kind of brisk, confident storytelling. Like, well, I need you to understand what's going on, so let me tell you what you need to know. So third person, let's just say it's fairly simply done to just lay it out there as needed. But in a first person narrated book, you can do the exact same thing. And I want to offer as proof that that is easily done what just happened when I told you the story of being in a Broadway musical that was told backwards in 1981. I'm a first person narrator right now. I'm just talking to you. It was extremely simple for me to say, let me tell you about this experience that I had in 1981 that's kind of relevant to this conversation. I think you'll find it illuminating. Tell you the story and then come back to the present moment. So, of course, you can do it in first person. So that's one way. Just lay it out there. And I'm going to talk about like the optimal way to do that and the less optimal way to do that in a minute. But let's just get these three options on the table first. You just tell them. The second one, and this is a very useful one, is that you can weave it into dialogue. And weaving backstory into dialogue it's a noble process. It certainly can be overdone, but someone in the world of your book can tell the story of what happened. So this relates a little bit to how I just explained that a first person narrator is fully capable of just delivering backstory as needed. It's the same in a scene that's in your book, whether it's narrated by a third person narrator or a first person narrator. There's dialogue. Individual characters are speaking. Some of them may tell stories about the past. Boom, done. That's it. You can get information in. They may treat each other in ways that weave in information about the past. If a character calls your protagonist by their childhood nickname, that's information about the past, right? That we didn't have until that character spoke. So you see the dialogue can be very useful this way. And what's the third way? This is what we're all here for today, right? Flashback. Full on flashback. Now, flashback is different than the first two options because flashback is a complete commitment to stopping the timeline of the story and going back in time, like you're in a time machine. It might be a hot tub time machine. That would be cozy, but it could be any kind of time machine you happen to have. And restarting the storytelling in a different timeline and just letting a scene happen as if we are there now in that timeline. And then when that flashback ends, somehow we get back in the time machine and we come back into the present moment of the storytelling. So it, as you see, it's like cutting it with a scissor, right? It's not a line of dominoes just ticking along, knocking each other over. It's like we get to the last domino over here, and then we start a new little series of dominoes just to the side. We let them run out their course, and then we go back to the original one. It's a much bigger disruption for the reader than this quick telling or summarizing of backstory or weaving it into the dialogue. Now, writers love flashbacks, though. They really do. And I guess the point that I really want to make today is that I understand why writers love flashbacks because they're luxurious. They allow you to do what writers love to do, which is to fully imagine the history of your character, things that have happened in the past, things that you need to know, things that as a storyteller you have to be very, very aware of. You've got to fully imagine all of this stuff in order to do a good job writing the story that you're telling. And I applaud this. I'm a big believer in taking a very deep dive, particularly into the character of your hero, and really knowing a lot about their inner workings, because the story that you're telling is going to rise from your deep understanding of their inner workings. The story that you're telling knows more about your hero than your hero knows about themselves. And that level of expertise, that knowing, is yours to deliver. That's what the writer's job is to achieve that. So chances are you will have imagined a lot of material about your hero's past, about the past of the world that you're in. And once you imagine it, you're a writer. You want to write it. You want to document it. And so you may feel very inclined to write scene after scene of the childhood stuff and the how we got here stuff and the big formative trauma stuff. Like you may really want to explore that. And I think you should. But does that mean all of those scenes end up in your finished book? This is where we have to be skillful. We have to be discerning. What we have to remember is that when we leave the present timeline of our book, we have pulled a full-on, like, the rug out from under the reader, and they are leaving behind the story that we've been telling them and getting engaged in what is essentially a new story that we're telling them. So my advice about how to sort through these three different options basically has to do with discipline. What we want to concentrate on when we have information that has to be brought into the story is to, first of all, define, like, what is the minimum viable amount of information that I need to bring in? How much of the past do you need to bring in to fill in these gaps in your reader's understanding of the characters, of the world, the relationships? What do they really need to know? Tolkien famously remarks in The Hobbit, after giving some backstory about Middle Earth and about these characters, all right, that's enough to get on with. And that's really what we need to be striving for, like the enough to get on with point. And it may be less than you think. And we have to balance this with my constant instruction to be specific, because you want to include the minimum viable amount in specifics. You don't want to say, well, she had an unhappy childhood and therefore she found it hard to trust, because that's generic. It might be true, and it might be a kind of a useful placeholder for a bit of imaginative work that you haven't done yet. But for the reader, it's much more interesting to give us the specifics of that. Why is this character's backstory unique to them? Why does it have unique consequences that are essential now to know, so that we can understand the story that we're currently hearing and being told? So the minimum viable amount, but not generic. So that's sort of the first thing that I want you to consider. The second thing that I want you to consider is, what is the least intrusive technique that you can use to bring in this information? Now, I can't tell you which one is right on a case-by-case basis, right? Because you're making decisions all the way through your drafting about how much information you feel the reader needs to have in order to be enough to get on with. But whatever you decide, however much information you decide to bring in, what's the least intrusive technique to bring it in? And this is so important, right? Because we want to disrupt the narrative as little as possible. We're going to disrupt it. That's okay. We're going to, ask our reader to bear with me. I'm going to tell you a story about something that happened in 1981. Okay, that's it. Now we're back. We're going to do that. We're going to try their patience a little bit. We're going to ask them to stay with us while we make a little digression. But we want to do it in the least intrusive way. We don't want to try their patience. We want to earn their patience, right? So what's the least intrusive technique? So obviously the flashback is the most intrusive technique. The other ones, which would be to just come straight out and tell the backstory, I mean, in a way, because it's direct, it can be handled very swiftly. It can be summarized. It can be woven right into the narration. I mean, that it's the least intrusive technique unless you go on for pages, right? So the least intrusive and the minimum viable amount definitely have to work together. Weaving it into the dialogue is another really fun technique, but here's where it can become intrusive. Dialogue typically just takes longer to get through because as soon as you've got characters speaking, you are in a scene. And when you're in a scene, your responsibility as a storyteller is to bring it to life in the mind of the reader. And so that means that the characters in the scene are physically present. They are in a physical space. They are having a conversation. You know, coffee is being served, planes are flying overhead, people are wearing uncomfortable clothes, the lights go out halfway through. Like all of the things that can happen in the physical world are going to happen. And of course, we want to use this kind of sensory detail, physical detail, to make that scene feel vivid. But it is a lot of real estate on the page if our only purpose is to weave in backstory. So I love the technique of weaving backstory into dialogue. I use it with a lot of glee in one of the later books in my middle grade series, The Incorrigible Children of Ashton Place. And I'll just tell you a little bit about what I do because I think it's instructive. There's an elderly character. His name is Great Uncle Pudge. And he is the last surviving crew member of a shipwreck that happened long ago, far, far earlier than 1981. That was a Broadway shipwreck of a different sort. Great Uncle Pudge was the cabin boy. He was a kid, so he's the sole surviving member of this shipwreck. And the heroes of the tale, for very important reasons of their own that the reader is in on, need to know exactly what happened on this shipwreck. And he's the only person who can tell them because he's the last surviving member. But he has sworn an oath never to talk about it. And he swore that oath to the admiral of the ship who was his friend. And the admiral is long dead. So it's this kind of a problem because they can't get him to tell them the story because he will only tell it the admiral is dead. So they have to concoct a scheme that one of them impersonates the admiral, convinces him that he is the admiral, and gets him to tell the story. And they finally get the information that they want. When they get there, the buildup has been quite elaborate, as you can tell, just from the way I'm explaining it. And so the storytelling is like deliciously drawn out because at this point, both the characters on the page, the protagonist and her sidekick, and the reader themselves have been waiting and waiting to hear this story, to get the clue, to get the answer. And so it's a lot of fun to have this character in a kind of a luxurious way draw out the telling of the story so that we get this essential backstory in dialogue. You know, another example of this kind of technique are those detective stories where one of the very common tropes of classic detective story is that there's this mystery and the detective is figuring it out and they figure it out before we do, right? That's something that we want in a detective story. We don't want to figure it out while the detective is still saying, boy, I wish I knew who the murderer was. And we're back here going, well, it's her, you know? So we are kept in the dark in a delicious way. It keeps the suspense up. And then there's that scene, right? Whether it's Columbo or Sherlock Holmes or whoever, where there's this scene where they tell the story of the crime based on what they've figured out, what they've deduced based on the clues. They rule out all the wrong suspects and they finally settle on the right one. And you can see there that part of the pleasure of those scenes, again, is that there is this delay of gratification. The backstory that we're waiting for, the piece of information that we came for, is being dangled out in dialogue because the character who's got it knows that we're on the hook. So they're building suspense into the storytelling. So that's just a couple of like examples of the nuances of the ways that you can use dialogue to weave in information from the past, to weave in backstory. You can raise the stakes of it so that it merits that amount of time. You can set it up so that the reader is just as interested in the process of hearing the story told as they are in finding out the long-awaited answer. But notice that I'm not saying, well, just write a 10-page dialogue scene in which the backstory is explained. See, that's going to be kind of an abuse of the reader's patience, because you're using a kind of a lengthy and elaborate setup, the dialogue in a scene, to deliver information that you could have done in a less lengthy way. It's not the minimum viable amount. So if you're going to use dialogue, you have to make it part of the storytelling. You have to make the delivery of the information part of the storytelling so that it merits being seen. All right, so that is the minimum viable amount, the least intrusive technique. And the last one is if you really do feel that the material that you want to bring in from the past merits a full flashback, why might it merit that? You know, that's the question you have to really ask. You have to be able to defend your decision. And to me, the reason that it might merit it is that if it is such a significant piece of storytelling that you don't want it to feel like backstory, it is actually an essential beat of the story that you're telling. Now, why might you have essential beats of storytelling that happen in a sense before your book begins? This is a really interesting technique. You will find often that some writers will choose to begin their storytelling, in other words, where line 1, chapter 1 begins, not on the first day of the hero's life, you know, not on the 6 months before things all went wrong, but at a very dramatic moment where, in a sense, the story is already in progress. Often this will be like a character who's been swept out of their original condition and is now what we would call structurally embarking on their adventure, embarking on the second act. And so a lot of the things that we might need to know about a character have to be woven in, because the writer, for purposes of pace, has decided to start the storytelling when a lot of the interesting things have already happened. Now, I'm going to, again, use an example from the Incredible Children series because it's one that I know well. The first book in that series begins with the protagonist already having left her original world. She's on a train on the way to this grand house, on her way to the job interview that's going to determine whether she gets this job as a governess and is going to take care of these 3 children whom she does not yet know were actually raised by wolves and are going to be quite a different handful than 3 ordinary children. She doesn't know this yet, but what she does know is that she found, through the assistance of the headmistress of her school, a job advertisement for this role of governess. It was presented to her, and a letter of recommendation was written. She applied for the interview. She got the interview. She's left school. Was taken to the train station with her little trunk and her little bag and her favorite book of poetry to console her. And she took the train ride, and she's just about to arrive at the station. And that's page 1, right? But there are weeks of immediate backstory that have happened to get her to the moment when she's just about to get off the train, arriving in this new world of adventure. It would be as if The Wizard of Oz began with Dorothy getting out of the wrecked house in Munchkin Land, right? We don't get to see what happened in Kansas. We're just going to start where the Technicolor starts, essentially. And what's going to happen? I don't know. She'll have to have a conversation with one of the characters about, well, you see, before this, I was a farm girl in Kansas, and I had a lot of problems because nobody was around to play with me. It wouldn't work quite as well in The Wizard of Oz, but it works perfectly well in the book that I wrote called The Mysterious Howling. But what I have to do is I have to weave in the scenes of finding the job advertisement, of having a little exchange with the headmistress, of being brought to the station, of being nervous on the train. Like, I have to kind of weave all that in super quick. And the only piece of it that I really want to give like a full moment of flashback is the moment where the headmistress reads the job advertisement aloud. Now, anybody who's been through Path the Storyteller already knows, like, that is the invitation to adventure. It is the moment that kicks off the entire plot. The invitation comes. The advertisement is in the newspaper. It is seen by a mentor figure who turns to Penelope Lumley, who's the protagonist, and says, Penelope, this is for you. This has got your name written all over it. It's perfect for you. I'm going to write your recommendation right now. You're going. No arguments. Like, it's a very Gandalf kind of moment. Like, off you go, Mr. Baggins. I'm not going to hear any arguments. And so that moment of storytelling is significant. It's too big to just tell later on, like, oh, yeah, well, here's how I found out about the job. See, my headmistress saw it in the newspaper. No. We want to bring those moments of key storytelling to life in the minds of our readers. So what I'm giving you right now is kind of a framework for how to decide whether a flashback is merited or not. And the way that I want you to decide is to examine whether it includes a key piece of storytelling that you don't want your readers to miss. If you have information to deliver, that's not enough. That's not enough of a reason. But if it's a key piece of storytelling, that might be enough of a reason. I'm going to just quickly look over here because I noticed that some of you have got some really interesting comments. I'm going to come back to these comments, Jaren, because I think they're sort of interesting. And Anne's got some other examples too. All right, so we'll come back to these. So let me just wrap up since we do have some comments to discuss. So here's the main thing. You're going to decide whether the flashback is merited, and you're going to be very stingy about it because you know how it's going to disrupt your reader. And when you go into that flashback, you need not include the whole experience that surrounded that. In the example that I just explained, the scene where Penelope's headmistress finds the advertisement happens over breakfast. They're in the dining hall at the Swanburn Academy, and there are other students around. Now, if I were to write a scene like that as part of the primary timeline of the book, I might choose to start at the beginning of breakfast when porridge was served to give all the girls at the table some moment of interaction with Penelope, to have Miss Mortimer, the headmistress, arrive. Everyone is excited to see her. The newspaper, like, I could have made a whole scene out of it, right? I could have had a whole group conversation. But this is a flashback. And so the rules have to apply. What's the minimum viable amount? What's the least intrusive way? And because it's a flashback, I'm really, really, really compressed and really stingy about it. And I only allow the moment when Miss Mortimer says, look at this advertisement. Look at this. Let me read what it says. This is perfect for you. That is brought to life for the reader. It's not summarized. It's portrayed in dialogue. It is a moment of flashback. But everything else about the girls and the table and the porridge and all the things, it's just summarized in a couple of sentences. It's not, so the whole flashback takes less than a paragraph because the paragraph sort of goes back in time, comes to life, and then it goes out again. And then we come back immediately and clearly to the present moment of the storytelling, which is what? Penelope getting off that train, ready to face this new challenge, this job interview that she's quite nervous about. All right, so those are the tips that we have here. And I have one more, but what we've talked about so far is to, use the minimum viable amount of backstory, to use the least intrusive technique to get it onto the page. And if you decide that a full flashback experience is merited, it's got to be because there's some significant beat of actual storytelling delivered, not mere information. And the scale of the flashback itself can be really compressed to just deliver the storytelling. You don't want to use the same pace of storytelling in a flashback as you do in the actual timeline of the story, of the sort of present day timeline of the storytelling. The reader should know this is a flashback. We're not staying here. We don't have to take off our coats. We're not going to stay here for any length of time. We just are popping in because something significant is going to happen. All right. And here's my last tip about flashbacks. This is key. You have to be super clear about getting into them and getting out of them. You can't be fuzzy. You can't be loose about it. You can't start telling people that you're in a Broadway musical and it's not going well and have them go, oh my goodness, I didn't know you were in a Broadway musical, and have you go on. And then like halfway through the conversation, you say, oh, I'm not in a musical now. Oh, that's something that happened to me when I was 19. That was a long time ago. And have them go, wait a minute. You were just talking as if it were happening. It's confusing, right? You can't do that. You have to kind of, we often use this idea of changing lanes, like when you're driving on a big California highway that's got all these lanes. You need to know what lane you're in. And when it's time to change lanes, you need to do it clearly and with confidence. And you get in that new lane and you stay there. You do not mush all over the road. It's not good driving and it's not good storytelling. So you need to make a very clear lane change into the past, and you need to stay there. And when it's time to come back to the present of the storytelling, you need to also be clear and confident and stay there. Some of the techniques that you can use to demarcate things like this are scene breaks or chapter breaks. If it's a substantial visit into the past, it might have this kind of delineation either at the beginning or at the end. But it's not necessary to do that because we do want to keep these flashbacks concise. So you just really need to frame it. You need to be as clear as me saying, well, in 1981, when this happened, like, boom, there's no confusion. When in doubt, be more clear than you think. This is a pretty good rule for storytelling because we as writers become so familiar with our own books that we can easily forget how much work it is for the reader to follow along, to just comprehend what's going on. We don't want them to read our books for comprehension. We want them to become fully immersed in the story that we're telling. And the harder we make them work to simply follow what's happening, the less emotional bandwidth they have to just get involved with what's happening. They're using their intellectual puzzle brain to just figure out, like, wait a minute, are we in the present or the past? Who's talking now? In the last page, she was middle-aged, but now it sounds like she's a kid. Like, I'm lost. Like, they get lost more easily than we think. This is not a criticism of readers. It's just that reading is really, it requires its own cognitive effort. And then to be immersed in a story fully is something that the reader basically can only do if they're relaxed enough to let us hypnotize them a little bit, right? We all know that you have to be kind of relaxed to be hypnotized. To daydream, it's not something we do when we're tense and engaged with some kind of high stakes activity. And so if we're making them work so hard to just follow it, they're not going to be able to enter that state, that dream state, the fictional dream. It's what we're really trying to create for them. So be super clear getting in and getting out. All right. So that's what I have to offer today about fiddling with the timeline of your storytelling, bringing in needed backstory information from the past, and particularly about how to decide when a flashback is necessary, how compressed it should be, and how clean you have to be getting in and out. So having said that, I'm going to look over at the comments. If you've got any questions or thoughts you want to share about this topic, this is a really good time to post them. Now, I am going to go back to Jaren's comment. We're just going to put it right up here and see what you've got to say, Jaren. Slightly unrelated to the topic of arranging scenes chronologically is the idea that an individual scene can be written or conveyed to the reader in reverse. Well, that's interesting, Jaren. And if you have done that in your writing, I would be curious to know more about it. But an individual scene written in reverse seems to me like I would really want to know what you were trying to achieve by that, because it seems like it would be very confusing to the reader. I would fear personally, because of my Merrily We Roll Along trauma, I would be very concerned about confusing the reader. Well, you do go on to ask, though, in what situations might it make sense to write a scene backwards? Well, I'm going to leave that question for you all to answer. If you can think of a situation in which it might make sense to write a scene backwards. It's possible that you can play a little bit. I mean, it sort of raises a whole other topic, which is kind of interesting. the idea of tense and point of view, right? Because we all know, I think, that when we choose the point of view, the narrative voice of our books, that we can write them in the continuous present, or we can write them in the past tense, so present tense or past tense. So this is something that readers struggle with. Maybe this is a topic for a future live stream. But if there's a jump in the timeline, you may find yourself doing little tricky things with the tense in your in a scene. I guess the one example that I think of, it's not quite what you're asking about, Jaren, so forgive me. I'm going to leave it to your colleagues here to say, is there a reason that you might write a scene that goes backwards in time? There's a wonderful moment in one of my favorite novels, Jane Eyre, which is told in the first person and is narrated by our protagonist, Jane. And there's a wonderful moment. We've been through this long saga with her, and she basically, at the beginning of a new scene, turns to the reader, figuratively speaking, and says, "Reader, I married him." And so all of a sudden, we learn that the entire story that we've been hearing is something that she's been telling us from a vantage point in time that's 10 years after her wedding to Mr. Rochester. So we've heard about her childhood, we've heard about her adolescence, we've heard about her as a young woman going to work for Mr. Rochester, we've heard about them falling in love with each other. This huge obstacle comes in the way. She goes and has other adventures, almost ends up marrying somebody else. Something else happens. It's all very wonderful. And she and Mr. Rochester finally get together. And then she says, "Reader, I married him." And it is now 10 years since that day. And so you see, there's like fun that you can have with timelines. But that's a little bit different, I would say, than deciding that something is being told in the reverse. Because what this does is it gives us this delicious surprise of meeting Jane now in what is, in a sense, her present day, after she's told us this long, riveting story about how she came to be, who and where she is now. So timeline actually is kind of a fun thing to play with. Now, Anne has got some great comments here. Anne, let's bring them up. Now, you are going to remind us of the prologue of a middle grade murder mystery that has a scene with Marco Polo on his deathbed and a flash forward to a murder. And then these happen just before the hero's story begins. So it sounds like there's a, just before the hero's story begins. So I don't know if that's it is a prologue. You're using the word prologue. Right. Sometimes writers will do something like include a prologue that's got an important piece of backstory. And, mysteries have their own delicious tropes about how you weave in suspenseful things from the past. Sometimes there will be that opening prologue, or I guess you've all seen these in crime shows, that sometimes they open with the murder being committed or some allusion to a murder being committed. And it's not really the main narrative, but it's what sets the narrative in motion, because we go to commercial, we come back, and there are the detectives looking at the pictures of the crime scene, and now we understand that it's their job to get it started. So that's, in a sense, like playing with the timeline a little bit by giving us a glimpse of something that's happened in the past and then jumping forward a little bit so we meet our heroes and the story can begin. It's including information for the reader in a particular kind of way. That's not always the way that to do it, though, of course, because there's just as many of those types of mystery stories that will introduce us to the character first, introduce us to the investigator, the detective character, and then very early on in the story, have the case be presented to them, right? That is like the invitation to adventure comes, and somebody walks in and says, "I need your help. So-and-so's been unjustly accused," or "there's been a murder and I've been accused. We need to find out who really did," like all the different ways that crime stories start. So it could work either way. But one of them is, in a sense, like tucking the first act, inciting incident, right? The invitation to adventure, but just before we start, and then beginning. And then the other one is starting with the protagonist, establishing their world, and then bringing that information into the straight ahead timeline of the narrative. And now let's see, we've got one more comment two more from Anne. So Anne thinks that this worked because it dangled the intriguing info that the reader is from then on trying to connect to all the ensuing events, right? But it's not pulling it out of sequence, Anne. I mean, that's the thing. You're talking about a prologue that basically includes this event that is now going to be the cause of what happens next. But you're not asking the reader to process this information out of order. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about messing with the timeline, of putting the dominoes out of order so that cause and effect become disconnected. This is where readers get lost. I just want to make sure that everyone understands this, if nothing else, from today's talk. If we disconnect causality, if we pull the plug out so that things happen without any sense of sequence, they're not causing each other to happen, that the changes wrought in one scene do not carry forward to have any impact on what happens next, the storytelling falls apart instantly. And so this is what we really want to avoid doing. And so other techniques that writers sometimes get very fond of, like switching viewpoint characters or having like multiple subplots, all of these serve to disrupt the clean narrative line. And so it's not that we never do them, but we do them responsibly. We do them with a full awareness of how much we're asking of our reader when we do them. And many writers forget how much they're asking of the reader every time they drop the narrative thread to go someplace else, to go back in time, to include information that is disconnected from the line of cause and effect that we've worked so hard to establish. Proceed with caution is my advice. And I want to thank you for making an attempt to answer Jaren's question, which is super interesting. Would you write a scene backwards if you wanted the reader to relate to the hero's confusion, and then they both go on to get clarity as the story goes on? So in a sense, you're writing the adventure of the audience in the opening night of Merrily We Roll Along, who just didn't know what was happening because the story was being told backwards. And then later on, at the end of the show, they were like, oh, it was being told backwards. Now I get it. This is a good way to end today, I think. Because it's, we started out by me saying storytelling is not information. And you may say, well, over the course of my book, or in the case of that show, over the course of an evening in the theater, the audience was indeed provided with all the information they needed to put the story together in their own minds. They were given all the puzzle pieces. And you may feel in your draft that you are providing all the puzzle pieces that your reader needs to assemble the story in their own mind. This is the difference between subscribing to one of those meal services where you get a box of ingredients and a instruction sheet with the recipe on it, and they've pre-shopped, they did the shopping, they figured out what you're going to make, but you still have to make the dinner. That's one experience. The other experience is that you go to a nice restaurant and you sit down and they've made this sort of spectacular meal and you're just there to enjoy it. When we offer our readers a novel to enjoy, we want to be the restaurant. For the most part, we don't want to be the you cook it at home meal prep kit. We want to be the restaurant. We want to have done all the work so that the reader doesn't have to. Reading the book is plenty of work. We have to earn the reader's time and attention. It's really important to remember this. We have to do that. And so much of the work we do in revision is getting realistic about where we have gotten a little bit lost in our own attachment to our book. We're so familiar with it. It's all old news to us that we forget that the reader is brand new to this experience. They are new to this world. They are new to this character. They're new to the way we write. They're starting on page 1 at the top, and that's their beginning, and they read one sentence at a time. And their level of expertise about the world and the story that we're giving them grows. It accrues the more they read. But when they've only read one sentence worth of our book, that's all they know. When they've read 2 sentences, that's all they know. When they get to the bottom of page 1, that is all they know. And so we have to be really, really careful, really aware of the sequence of what we present to them, because it's going to determine whether they can follow along, whether we're giving them the things they need up front to care, to keep reading. If we give them the stuff that makes them care about our main character on page 20, I mean, we may say, well, I gave it to them. It's there. They'll get to it. So, well, they might not, because if they don't care about the main character, they will have put the book down on page 7. They've moved on to another book they like better. We have to earn every page turn. So you've got to curate the reader's experience very intentionally. And this is a kind of an overview, an overarching precept of writing good fiction, but it's particularly relevant to these questions about kind of indulging ourselves with, like, well, I have all this cool backstory and I just want to put it in, or I wrote a flashback and it's 5 pages long. Like, by the time the reader gets to the end of that flashback, they will have forgotten the original story you're trying to tell them, right? So you don't want to really try the reader's patience that way. And this is not to make readers sound like unintelligent or unambitious. Readers engage with difficult fiction all the time. It's just that you are going to be making a choice about how difficult you want your fiction to be. If you want it to be difficult, if you want it to be very hard to read and very experimental and play by your own rules, no one is telling you you can't do that. There are no fiction writing police who are going to come get you. And I love all kinds of work. I like really conventional work. I like really wild and inventive work. I like experimental work. I love all kinds of culture. But we have to be realistic about what we're aiming for. And so when you hear me talk about this, what I'm saying is not that you must never aim for something that's difficult or experimental. What I'm saying is, if you're aiming to tell a coherent story, but you're undisciplined, you've written something difficult by accident. It wasn't your intention. So, you need to actually kind of get hold of what your intentions are and be true to them. Okay? So all you experimental writers out there, I know that I love you. You go ahead and write challenging work. You have to be realistic about what the readership will be. It will be a smaller readership, but there are readers who will go along for a ride if you give them a good ride. All right, my friends, thank you so much for being here today. Oh, Katie, let me just say hello. I'm very glad that you were here today. I'm very grateful for those of you who come live, those of you who watch the replay and leave comments. It's always fun. If you are watching on YouTube and you're not already subscribed to the channel, I really am hoping that you will subscribe. There's tons of content on this channel now, and we'll continue to add more. So you'll get a notification if you click the little bell about the next time I'm going live or post a video. And if you are not on the path of the storyteller mailing list, you know what I want you to do. Just get over to that website, add your name. You'll get an email asking you to confirm, just to make sure that you want to be on my mailing list, which I hope you will. And then we'll get to know each other better, which I would like very much. All right, my friends, until the next time we are together, happy writing, and pay attention, pay attention in the stuff that you read and the stuff that you might watch, because obviously flashbacks and backstory affect all kinds of storytelling, whether it's television or movies or whatever. Take note of when the timeline leaps around and the impact that it has on you as a viewer. I think you'll find it an interesting exercise, as always. All right, till next week. Happy writing.